Welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the University of Utah's Political Science Department. We would like to thank our streaming sponsor, AARP Utah, for making our virtual forums this fall possible. We would also like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is the Presidency. We are joined by panelists, Jim Curry, Associate Professor of the University of Utah Political Science Department, Eric Hinderrocker, Distinguished Professor of History from the University of Utah, Josh Ryan, Associate Professor of Political Science at Utah State University, and Cody Stevens, Visiting Professor with the University of Utah History Department. Today's conversation will be moderated by award-winning journalist Jennifer Napier-Pierce. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them into the YouTube chat. And with that, we'll get started.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to see you. I'm here in the home office. Our distinguished panel also tuning in virtually. So please, use the chat function. We'd love to have this interactive. Later on in the program, we'll be asking for your questions. But to start, gentlemen, we look around the world. What really sets the American presidency apart from other governmental structures? I mean, there's something fundamentally unique because we call this person the leader of the free world. So who would like to start? Maybe Professor Curry?
That's a really good question to start with. On one hand, the American presidency isn't totally and completely unique in that there are a number of other countries that have presidential systems. On the other hand, part of what makes the American presidency what it is first just the US's place in the world. And so then the president's place as sort of leader of that sort of country that seems to be the predominant hegemon of the modern period, which really puts a global focus on the individual holding the presidential office that you don't get with any other president in another presidential system. And another thing that's not completely unique to the American presidency, but that does shape it in some ways that make it different from some other presidents of presidential systems, is that the president of the United States plays not just a chief governmental role, but a chief symbolic role in our country. He is both head of state and head of government, which puts a kind of focus on the president that you don't necessarily get from heads of government in other countries or from heads of state. And in some other countries, a president is more ceremonial and more symbolic. It's a sort of head of state sort of figure. In other places, he or she is more of a head of government. But in the US, the president of the United States manages or has to fill both roles.
Professor Ryan, anything to add there?
Yeah, I think Jim made a good point about the separation in most other countries between the symbolic role of the president and sort of a chief of government role of the president. I want to add one thing that's a little bit unique as well about the American system compared to a lot of other Western style democracies, especially those in Europe. The president has no sort of power over the legislative branch. Constitution says very clearly that the executive branch and legislative branch are separated. And we think today, our country is sort of very president-centric. We sort of give the president credit when things go well. We blame the president when things go wrong. Laws are created by the legislative branch, by Congress, and fundamentally the president can't force Congress to do anything. The president has no institutional power really over Congress and over the lawmaking process. That's quite unique when we think about most other Western style democracies in Europe. The president is a member, or sort of the head of state is a member of the legislative branch. So Great Britain, the prime minister is a member of the legislature. And that's not true in this country. And it makes for an interesting dynamic where the president tries to sort of convince Congress to do things, but can't really force Congress to do anything.
That is an interesting point. And I do think that when we look at this particular moment in time, let's get to that in a little bit, because there are tensions, and definitely we can see them in stark relief right now at this moment. Let's go back in time, though. Let's go back to history. The founders of this country set up 3 separate but equal branches of government. So what was the unique role of the presidency supposed to play in this system? And Professor Hinderaker, how about you take that one first?
Sure, I'm happy to talk about that. At the time of the founding, at the time of the American Revolution, there was a lot of mistrust of, a head of state. People commonly thought that this kind of supreme office in any governmental system was the one that was most likely to tend toward tyranny. And so in the state constitutions that were written during the Revolution, the governors had very little power. They mostly were, served for a single term. The state constitutions stripped them of the power to appoint people to office. And in fact, that's when the term president originated. The colonies that all had royal governors, and calling a head of state a president rather than a governor meant that they envisioned this as essentially a purely executive role in relation to the legislature, merely presiding over government, right? Not actually exercising the powers of government. And so the federal constitution is pretty interesting in the extent to which it reversed that commonly held assumption of the 1770s, because our Constitution, well, 2 things. One, it says so little about what actually, the powers of the presidency are. But to the extent that it does talk about them, it grants them, by the standards of the 1770s and 1780s, it grants the president an extraordinary amount of power. He's the commander in chief. As Josh said, he does not play a direct role in the legislature, but he has the power of the veto, which was a very controversial idea in the 1770s and 1780s. He also has, the power to nominate and appoint an unspecified range of government officers. So, it's interesting how much the Constitution, on the one hand, is kind of a blank slate, but on the other hand, gives pretty dramatic new powers to this head of state that really ran against the presumptions of the 1770s and 1780s.
Professor Stevens, can you characterize what the discussions were when they were trying to parse out what executive power should be, how to define it? Were there any particular conversations or discussions among the founders that you find particularly relevant today?
Well, no. The answer is no. I actually am not a constitutional scholar. I do a 20th century, but I will maybe use this as an entry point to. I wanted to add something actually to the first question you asked, which is, why is the U.S. president unique? And I want to kind of maybe jump off of some of the things that Professor Curry said, which is, one, I think right now in the current era, the U.S. presidency is unique because of the really unprecedented power that the United States has in world affairs, and that includes just the president's role as the commander-in-chief of just awesome military strength. That includes the role of the U.S. in international political institutions that were really constructed by the U.S. Largely in favor of extending U.S. interests, and also in the role of the American president as the head of state. That extends to the kind of the role of the U.S. president in maintaining soft power and maintaining the U.S. position in international relations through as the kind of chief, diplomat in chief. It has a very specific role in trying to ensure that we have good diplomatic relations with other countries throughout the world.
Professor Stevens, let me stick with you. George Washington, I understand, was something of a reluctant president. Like, what were the reasons why he sort of held back or I don't want to say withdrew, but he didn't really fully, embrace this or champion it.
Embrace what? The presidency?
Yeah.
I don't know, Eric, you want to maybe take?
I mean, I'm happy to speak to that a little. I think Washington, was at the end of the Revolutionary War was interested in retiring to private life. At least that's what he claimed. He attended the Constitutional Convention in 1787 reluctantly, and only after he'd been persuaded by correspondence that the future of the Union, the Confederation of States, was in the balance. And I think he kind of undertook the presidency in something of the same spirit. One of the things that's often said about the office of the president, as it's outlined in the Constitution, is that it made people a lot less nervous to presume that the first person to hold this office was going to be George Washington. And he had a very strong, ethic of kind of public responsibility. So despite his wish to spend some of his adult life in private pursuits, he agreed to serve. And I think that was a really important decision on his part, actually, because he may have been unique, actually, in his ability to kind of embody the office in a way that a broad spectrum of the American public was comfortable with in the 1780s, late 1780s and into the 1790s.
Well, certainly that's not the case today. Politicians are going for it, and we saw a whole slate of candidates charging toward that office this go around. So Professor Hinderaker, you said that you alluded to the Constitution, that there's not a whole lot in there. There are some constitutional requirements. You have to have been born in the US, which comes up from time to time. You have to have lived here for 14 years at least, and be at least 35 years old. I mean, has there ever been any attempt to change those basic requirements?
Not any serious one that I'm aware of. I mean, it is a subject of conversation periodically. But there's not, particularly, I just recently saw a journalistic reference to the stipulation that the president has to be a natural born citizen. But I don't think there's ever been, a kind of concerted political movement in the direction of changing the qualifications for president. They're pretty minimal, actually.
Professor Curry, anything to add there?
No, I think most of what we hear discussed about the presidency is constant discussion about what the nature of the president's power should be versus what it is, and that's been a debate that's gone on since 1789 in Washington and throughout the country. And there's also always been debate about how we should elect the president. The Electoral College has been controversial for a very long time. And I did want to tack on to a little bit on the discussion on George Washington. And that's something that always strikes me as being interesting about Washington, is that, in addition to him just being somebody that embodied sort of what they envisioned as a president and leader of the country for so long, he was also unique in the sense that he was the only sort of quasi-consensus choice to become president in 1789. And it'd be interesting if he declined for us to think through how that may have played out in terms of affecting our system of presidential elections. Because it may have been that nobody would have had a majority of the vote in the Electoral College in 1789, because there may not have been enough consensus around anyone else. And we may have had the first president selected by the Congress, as the Constitution stipulates, and that may have become a norm in the absence of someone like Washington, who could command a majority in the Electoral College the first two times.
Would that have shaken the foundation of this fledgling democracy, though? I mean,
I don't think so, because I think that's how many of the founders expected the Electoral College to work. In many ways, they built in a lot of rules to try to force the Electoral College to come to something closer to a consensus. That's why the original stipulation said that each elector got 2 votes, and one of those votes had to be, those 2 votes couldn't be to people from the same state, which forced them to try to think beyond their state boundaries. But I think some of them expected that every presidential election would be resolved in the House of Representatives anyway. So it's interesting that Washington's sort of consensus nature as the first president may have disrupted that expectation and led to sort of the system we have today.
Yeah, if I can just jump in on that, the other thing that was not anticipated, I mean, Jim makes a great point. The other thing that was not anticipated is the rise of partisan politics. The founders never really thought about parties, which is kind of odd. I mean, British politics had divided in partisan way in the 18th century. But Washington is the one president who really, is above party in the entire span of American history, because it's really at the end of his term of service that a kind of partisan divide developed for the first time. So while the founders were interested in something that would just arrive smoothly at the determination of a president, and they weren't particularly concerned about a purely democratic process. That is to say, they thought it was fine if the House of Representatives made this decision on behalf of the American people. As partisanship increased, really beginning with the election of 1800, the idea of a kind of, what the actual head count is, becomes more and more important in American electoral politics. It's not something that the founders really envisioned at all.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, speaking of partisanship, it's a very good segue into fast forwarding 200 years plus to today. So let's look at the presidency today. I'd like each of you just to address the question how the Trump presidency has really changed the office or not. And then we can drill down on some of the threads that you bring up. So let's start with Professor Ryan.
That's an excellent question. It's very difficult to know while a presidency is still right in the process. Donald Trump is still president. He may be president for another 4 years, depending on what happens in November. It's very difficult to get historical perspective or political perspective on how the office is going to change. I would say President Trump has tried to change the office in a number of ways. He's certainly been sort of more willing, I think, than past presidents to excoriate political opponents, even sometimes political allies. He's quite willing to sort of go after them publicly, call them out for a lack of support in him. You can think, for example, after the 2018 elections, for example, Mia Love, Congresswoman from Utah, after she lost, he tweeted out, "She didn't support me enough. That's why she lost." And that sort of messaging is really quite unprecedented from a president. Now, certainly, partially, this is a function of technology, and this may be the future of the presidency, is this very sort of public-facing figure who's going to be out there, who's going to be using technology a lot. And we think this is what presidents have tried to do in the last 50 or so years with the rise of other technologies like radio and television, is appeal directly to the public. I would say President Trump has taken that to a new level in a lot of ways. Whether that continues with future presidents, it's hard to say. Some people do see this as sort of a violation of norms, that we don't want presidents to be this out there, this sort of in your face, this public with disputes. And I imagine if a potential President Biden might, shall we say, retreat on that front a little bit. But I could easily see the presidency becoming something that's much more public and sort of aggressive in terms of trying to corral allies and go after opponents than what we've seen in the past.
Professor Stevens.
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I would say I think President Trump represents a kind of a culmination of a lot of tendencies that we've seen building up over a long period of time in changes in the powers of that the president has, and in the partisanship that we view between the two parties, and the way that the two parties are sort of increasingly trying to entrench themselves in power for longer periods of time and willing to demonize one another to do so. And I think so. So Trump has not just more, as Professor Ryan said, not just maybe more willing than past presidents to excoriate political opponents. I think he's more willing than past presidents to suggest that that political opponents are criminals, should be criminalized, and are in fact, a danger to democracy. That there's something as it would be dangerous to have a transfer of power from one party to the other. And like I said, I don't think it's new per se. I think it's something that's been developing for a long period of time. But I do think it is more extreme and more exaggerated right now than it has been in the recent past. And it's, I think it is a change in norms, and one that maybe is not necessarily that healthy.
Professor Hinderhofer, and then Professor Curry.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what Josh and Cody have just said. I think that if you look at at modern U.S. history, the 50s and 60s and really 70s, 80s were presided over by a generation of people who had a kind of shared unifying experience of World War II that I think was a really sufficiently wrenching and world-changing situation that in many ways, I think partisanship kind of took a back seat to, a kind of shared sense of patriotic identity and shared involvement in a shared project. And it's really striking to me the way that, as that World War II generation has passed from the scene, it feels like there is less and less to kind of moderate a sense that partisanship is everything. And it's clear that President Trump has doubled down on patterns and processes that have been, showing themselves more and more since the beginning of the 21st century. My only hope is that Twitter is a passing technology and some other communication medium will take its place. It's not my favorite way for people to exchange ideas and express themselves, but it seems to be a pretty powerful force of the moment.
It seems like we're not just talking about the norms of the presidency, but he's also changed the social norms of what is polite in society, social discussions and things like that. Professor Curry.
If I could, something that I think we know to be true about the presidency is that each president does a lot to shape what the presidency and what our politics is like after they're out of office. And in some ways, you can make an argument that presidents have more impact on sort of the future in terms of what happens after they're out of office than they do while they're in office, in part because the president is such a central focus in our governmental system and in our society. And then each subsequent president is kind of reacting to the preceding presidents and the presidents before them. I mean, you can certainly see this with Donald Trump, who in some ways is reacting to sort of Republican and conservative unease with the Obama administration, and sort of a reaction in many ways to Obama's style, which was very different. But I think the key variable that we don't know yet is exactly how the Trump presidency will be remembered or thought of. Presidents that are viewed as successful and great tend to have more influence over sort of the norms of the office going forward than those that are seen as failures or those who are rebuked. If Donald Trump is rebuked in November, if then subsequently the Republican Party views the Trump administration as not sort of a model for winning elections and governing going forward, you may see his influence be that there is a counter reaction to his personal political style. On the other hand, if he wins and sort of embeds in the political system that this is how you win now and this is how you govern, his impact could be that future presidents and future politicians adopt more of this sort of combative norm busting style that we've seen him use since 2015.
Professor Curry, does the combative style though extend beyond mere rhetoric? Is it more than just communication? You talked about expansion of powers. Are you seeing that sort of a shift come as a result of the rhetoric.
So this is where we may find more disagreement in what I have to say, and in that I think it's primarily rhetorical. I don't think the Trump presidency has done that much to actually expand the literal or effective powers of the office. In some ways, Trump is inheriting already fairly powerful presidential office and using those levers. But I see the way that people react to the Trump administration tends to be primarily around his rhetoric, where he'll often say, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z, or I won't do X, Y, and Z. But he doesn't often follow through on those promises. But they're so outlandish and they're so aggressive and they're so contra to how we view the norms of the office that of course they get a lot of attention, but they aren't always followed through on. And I would wager to say that they may be not even followed through on a majority of the time.
Any disagreement? Professor Ryan, yes.
Yeah, I actually very much agree with Jim. I don't believe that President Trump has sort of expanded the formal or informal powers of the office. I think a lot of it is rhetorical. And part of that, I think, is party polarization, which is the background to what we've all been talking about, and which Eric mentioned, which is you've got these two very, very divided parties. They're becoming more divided. They've been becoming more divided since about the 1980s. Doesn't look like there's much hope that we're going to unify anytime soon. So you've got presidents who are sort of very popular with their base, not very popular with the other party. President Trump has never been a very popular president. His approval ratings generally hovered around 40%, 43%. These are not recipes for a president to expand the office. These are recipes for a president to sort of occupy the office. And when I say expand the office, I mean sort of institutionally in terms of formal and informal powers. And as Jim mentioned, the presidency is already quite powerful, but I don't view President Trump as having done a lot to sort of expand the sort of purview of the presidency, done a lot of things that we would accept as sort of the president's power going into the future.
But words do have impact. And I'm thinking of, recent campaign rallies where President Trump has really tried to undermine the trust in the election cycle. Mail-in voting, there's lots of fraud, and there's no proof that goes along with those words, but the words do create seeds of distrust and fear. Professor Hinderaker, you're nodding.
Yeah, I think that's one of the really interesting things about President Trump. In the history of the office, whatever strategies have gotten someone elected, most presidents have regarded themselves as heads of state, heads of the whole people. And it's really striking the extent to which President Trump has, has kind of eschewed messaging that is aimed at the body politic at large in favor of this style of messaging. He seems to revel in, sowing a certain amount of chaos. I don't know if other panelists will agree with me, but I think that that Jim and Josh are right. I would also say that Trump has not done anything to expand the power of the presidency. If you look, for example, at the number of executive orders he's issued, it's kind of in line with the modern pattern and many fewer than was true earlier in the 20th century. So you don't see a president, that is exercising the authority of the office in an unusual way, but you do see this extraordinary kind of rhetorical performance over and over again that seems to be aimed at, sowing fear and uncertainty and confusion. It's hard to read it any other way. The response to COVID-19 is such an interesting example because, you can imagine a president who would have simply chosen a line and tried to maintain consistent messaging. But Trump seemed to have consciously taken the other path, right? And he has in fact chosen a series of conflicting messages. And it seems to me that it's part of his strategy to kind of keep everybody off balance. It's been true in foreign policy, it's been true in so many different contexts during the course of his term as president. And it's That part of his presidency feels wholly unfamiliar to me. I cannot think of another example of a president who so reveled in his capacity to sow confusion and just, the kind of the fear that stems from that uncertainty that his utterances can create.
Professor Stevens, when we talk about partisanship, there was a lot of hand wringing around the convention, holding his speech at the White House, him using military to part the crowd so that he could stand in front of the chapel with the Bible. When we talk about excessive power, do those gestures mean anything to you? Does it have any lasting effect, or is it just gesturing?
Well, they do mean something to me, and I do think that they are important. I think they're important even if they are just gesturing, right? And I can very much agree with what Eric said, that this is this kind of effort to sow chaos is part of a deliberate strategy by Trump, and it's part of a deliberate strategy to sow divide and to stir up what he knows is his base. And so this symbolism, which is, I think he relies on a lot of symbolism of himself as, head of the military. He relies on a lot of uber patriotic symbolism, and he will stand in front of the church holding the Bible. So he knows who his base is. He knows who he's speaking to, and he is deliberately, trying to stir up that base. And I agree also with what other people said. He hasn't maybe expanded the office of the presidency. He inherited a strong presidency, and the presidency has been gaining increasing powers, especially over the last 2-3 decades, relating to the war on terror. But he has, he had the powers that the presidency has. I think he has mobilized those in really potentially ways that to me are potentially very, very disturbing. Am I cutting out? I notice am I cutting out?
A little choppy, but you're okay.
Okay, all right, sorry. Yeah, sorry for the, I think, for example, the way he's dealt with protesters, and this may also just be rhetorical and symbolic, where he sends unmarked federal officials to go into cities and to round up protesters. These people are usually held for a few hours at a time for questioning and then released without charges. So that may be something that he's doing like other things somewhat symbolically, but I think it's a really dangerous precedent, right? And this is a way to intimidate opposition. It's a way to I think naturalize and desensitize certain activities by the government that are traditionally not something we associate with democracy.
Well, Professor Curry, I know you've got a comment, and maybe you can fold this into it, because when we talk about gestures, rhetoric, things like that, there is pushback from people who say this is a slide into fascism, authoritarianism is around the corner. As somebody who studies this stuff, is that how you kind of see this evolving?
No, and certainly not necessarily. Again, and I find, and I don't want this to come across as if I don't find the things that Donald Trump does and says to be concerning, because they are, and they should be viewed as concerning by all Americans who are interested in a democratic form of government and in democratic norms. But I think the key, what this hinges on in terms of the long-term impacts of Trump's style and his rhetoric and his approach to the office, is whether or not he succeeds in terms of winning re-election and being viewed as being successful with this style of running the presidency. If he loses in November and it's sort of viewed as a rebuke of his style, which I think it will be, because this election, like all elections with an incumbent president, is ultimately about referendum on the president. That could have the long-term effect of sort of making his approach, his rhetorical approach, his general approach to the office be viewed as something that we don't want to repeat, or that future politicians don't want to copy because it didn't work well. Now, if he wins, now on the other hand, if he wins the re-election to the presidency, now politicians could say like, well, he's brought this style and this approach twice, and it worked twice to help him win the office. I mean, this isn't the first time we've seen presidents sort of act sort of dangerously powerful in certain ways in the office. The Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon administrations also used domestic law enforcement in wildly inappropriate ways. The key was that there was a backlash after Nixon was almost impeached and then had to resign in disgrace from the office. And you had sort of this sort of general public and political backlash to that style of running the presidency that lasted at least for a while. Before maybe after 9/11, you had sort of like a renewed focus on that kind of power. So I really think that it's uncertain in terms of where this goes in the future. And November's outcome is going to play a big role in sort of shaping the degree to which, or the way in which our government and our political system reacts to how Trump has used the office.
You brought up the I word, impeachment, and I know it feels like 100 years ago, but it was just in February. It was this year that happened. President Trump, of course, one of 3 U.S. presidents who has been impeached. And I guess, Professor Ryan, I'm interested in your thoughts about was there anything unique about this impeachment process that we haven't seen in the 2 previous rounds?
Yeah, I think the unique thing about this impeachment process is the whole thing didn't seem like that big of a deal. It was very obvious from the beginning what was going to happen. The Senate was definitely not going to remove him from office. It was framed as in very partisan terms. Democrats were generally supportive of impeachment for what they saw as a serious breach of conduct, which was they viewed President Trump as essentially asking a foreign country to investigate his chief rival for the office. Republicans didn't see this as a big deal, and the whole thing seemed to happen very quickly. It seemed to be dispensed of very quickly, and of course, a lot of serious issues have happened since then, which is why it seems so long ago. But previous impeachments were huge deals. The impeachment of President Clinton, which I remember, though I was somewhat young, that was a very big deal to the country. It was on the news every night. It was on the evening news. There was breathless reporting on the evidence and on various statements made by Monica Lewinsky and things that Kenneth Starr released. It wasn't immediately obvious what was going to happen in the Senate to President Clinton, whether he's going to be removed. And the vote was relatively close. There was actually a majority in the Senate to remove him, though not the supermajority that's required. And this impeachment seemed very ephemeral. It just seemed to happen very quickly, and it didn't really galvanize the country or develop the salience that I believe previous impeachments have. And I think that's the most unique thing about it, is it was sort of dismissed, and it seems, frankly, like it was dismissed by the American public as another thing that has occurred during the Trump administration. And if you were a Democrat, you saw this as more evidence of his bad behavior. If you're a Republican, you saw this as more evidence of the Democrats going after him. And that was it.
Professor Hinderaker, I'm curious about your thoughts on this. Was it a shrug? Was it a yawner and people just don't care? And if so, why? Why was it characteristically different from what happened with Johnson and Clinton?
I mean, it's a good question, and I think I sort of agree with Josh. I want to partially dissent, though, and say that I think the main difference in the level of public interest between the Clinton impeachment and the Trump impeachment may have had to do with the kind of salacious character of the subject matter. In the case of Clinton, but my recollection of the Clinton impeachment is that was also a highly partisan enterprise in which Democrats were not willing to take seriously the gravity of the charges against Clinton. I mean, the one thing we can say about the Trump impeachment process is it's the first time in the 3 impeachment votes that we have had that somebody crossed party lines. Both the Johnson and the Clinton impeachments were entirely partisan affairs, and neither president was removed from office. That was true again. It may be that the proceedings had a little more gravity, but I think impeachment is something that's really hard to generate a bipartisan consensus around. The really astonishing example to me is the Nixon example, when under threat of impeachment, a group of senior Republican leaders approached President Nixon and said to him that they no longer had, he no longer had their confidence, and they thought for the good of the country he should resign, and he did it. And I don't think that, to me, in retrospect, seems like the extraordinary exception to the pattern that has otherwise governed impeachment processes in U.S. history.
Professor Curry, you're chomping at the bit, I can tell. Maybe not. Professor Curry, did you have something to add?
Oh, I'm just very strongly in agreement.
Okay.
I just really strongly agree with how Eric laid it out. In that, am I cutting out?
No. Hello? Okay, well, let's move on. You gotta love these Zoom chats. I'm curious about executive orders. Of course, the presidents have the power to use this tool when Congress just isn't moving fast enough on policy priorities. When we think about President Trump, we think that he's signed a lot of these, but I think that he's pretty much in line with his predecessors. Is that the case, Professor Stevens?
I don't know.
Oh, sorry.
It's okay.
Okay, Professor Ryan, do you have thoughts on that?
I do. I think Eric, I'll defer to Eric because it looks like he wants to say something.
Well, I was just going to say, I was actually curious about this myself before we started this forum, and the University of California at Santa Barbara has a website called the American Presidency Project, and they have a page that just has a table of executive orders by presidents. And so you can actually, see pretty clearly. They make the point that this refers only to numbered executive orders, and there have been lots of executive orders that didn't fall into that category. So it's not by any means complete, but it does give you some portrait of the pattern of executive orders, in history. And what you can see pretty clearly is that there have been numerous presidents that have exerted their executive authority much more than Donald Trump has. Theodore Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin Roosevelt, those were all presidents that used the power quite extensively. Trump is using it a little bit more than Obama and a little bit more than Bush, but not dramatically more.
Yeah, and I would add to that, we were talking about sort of whether presidential power has expanded under President Trump. It's interesting to contrast him with somebody like President George W. Bush. My view of the W. Bush administration was that he expanded presidential power, attempted to expand presidential power quite dramatically. He was, especially in foreign policy, he was very aggressive, using the tools at his disposal. Theory of the unitary executive was developed in his administration, or at least sort of brought to the fore in his administration. The creative use of signing statements occurred during President Bush's administration, and I should say that a lot of those sort of powers or strategies were carried over into the Obama administration. Once the institution of the presidency takes those powers, it's hard to give them up, even when you have a change in parties. And I don't see President Trump. My impression is he hasn't used things like executive orders, signing statements, or other tools in the same way to sort of expand his powers, especially when you contrast him with somebody like George W. Bush.
Professor Curry, go ahead.
Yeah, if I could, I generally agree with that. I don't think the Trump administration has pushed as far, though I will say that every administration has innovated in its own unique ways. And Josh did a really great job sort of laying out the ways that the George W. Bush administration sort of innovated in presidential power. The Obama administration did a lot with regulations and with waivers. Waivers that the executive branch could give to states away from requirements by essentially strong arming them and saying, well, if you do what we want on policy, we'll give you this waiver that you desperately need, especially on education policy. And the Trump administration, if they've had an innovation, it's really been in Trump's very creative and aggressive use of temporary appointments throughout the executive branch. Whereas rather than actually running appointments through the Senate confirmation process, has just appointed people on a temporary basis and then just left them in that temporary position for as long as possible, which has allowed him to staff the executive branch with people that potentially are more loyal to him, or that he might not be able to get through a Senate confirmation process without having to even bother with it, which is quite an innovation that I don't think we've given his administration enough credit for in terms of executive power.
I want to get to some questions. This is for Professor Stevens. Can you speak to the expansion of executive power, especially in foreign policy over time? What were some of the key factors that drove that expansion of power? Do you see it rolling back, maintaining where it is, or expanding even further?
Yeah, I think executive power in relation to foreign policy has expanded a lot over the course of the 20th century. And I think there's various reasons for that, one of which is that some of which are related to foreign policy specifically, and some of which are related to the way that foreign policy and the changes to the executive have interacted with other parts of domestic politics. So for some reasons, foreign policy just kind of lends itself to a strong executive. And this is because I think the decision making is not entirely in the hands of the American public in the first place, right? You have to sort of respond to what other powers are doing. The American public feels very vulnerable when it comes to issues of national security, and so it's very easy to leverage that vulnerability into arrogating more powers. And also, decision-making in some cases often has to take place in a temporal horizon that doesn't lend itself to extended democratic deliberation. And so I think when you combine all of these elements, what you see is an American public that has generally been more willing to accept secretiveness and insularity in foreign policy than they might be in other policy realms. And then what I think that over time that has interacted with other elements, such as I think this partisanship that we're talking about, to create a situation where the power is kind of consistently ratcheted up in the executive branch, and then powers that the executive branch takes on are sustained through subsequent. Where is it going from here? I think that's a really challenging question. If anything, I think the world looks most like it did on the eve of World War I, where we have really a changing balance of power on the international level. We have really, I think, intense partisanship and intense social polarization is reminiscent of kind of the late Gilded Age and early and the Progressive era. And so I just don't. It's really tough for me to anticipate the answer to that question, where we go from here.
When we do look at history, though, Professor Stevens, President Trump has been willing to engage in non-diplomatic diplomacy, I guess. He's willing to interact with dictators. He is talking with, officials from North Korea and Russia and people that usually American presidents shy away from. Do you think that is an open door that may stay open?
Well, I don't know. I'll say I think that's kind of a geostrategic miscalculation. I think in doing so, Trump is really has fostered alienating a lot of U.S. more important allies, and really deteriorating the position of the United States in the eyes of a lot of traditional U.S. the public of traditional U.S. allies in other parts of the world. So now, a lot of especially European populations really have a negative view of the United States right now, and I think seeing Trump willing to cozy up to dictators certainly contributes to that, and so I think that hurts a lot of the more important alliances that the U.S. has throughout the world.
There are so many great questions here, so I want to kind of zoom through some of them. Professor Curry, take this one. The Emergency Powers Act was signed into law by President Ford in 1976. There are rumors that President Trump is considering using it to postpone the election. Your thoughts?
My thoughts on the rumors? My thoughts would be that they're probably not true, since most rumors aren't. And then my other thought would be that he probably doesn't have the authority to do that, since the Emergency Powers Act is vague, but I can't imagine that he would have the authority from that act to postpone the election. That's something that's set by Congress, and then elections are run by the states. Whether, just on this topic of Trump's rhetoric around whether or not we were going to have a fair election, or his earlier rhetoric around whether or not we should postpone the election, or things like that. For better or for worse, we're having one of the most decentralized election system in the world, if not the most decentralized election system in the world. States and localities essentially run our elections, with Congress providing some regulatory role. And that can be awful and frustrating in the 2000 election in particular, where with the debacle in South Florida really showed that. But on the other hand, an upside of having a decidedly decentralized, frustrating election system is that it's much harder for an executive to steal the election, because the chief executive doesn't have much influence over the election itself, and would have to get thousands of different people throughout the country to coordinate with him to do it, and many of whom want to see him out of office and simply wouldn't go along with it. And so in some ways, it is a safeguard against sort of authoritarian populism in our country that other countries don't benefit from, even if that decentralized process is totally frustrating most of the time.
Professor Hinderaker, I'm going to shoot this one to you. At the founding, there was some conversation of a dual executive. Given that the role of the president has expanded so dramatically since the founding, should the executive be broken into separate positions? Is it too much power or responsibility for one person? And do you think the president has too much power?
Well, this can take us back to the conversation that we had at the beginning of our hour about the symbolic role of the president versus the active role of the president. In matter of fact, the executive functions of the office of president are divided among many, many people. And so, I don't know that the idea of a dual executive offers much relief. I don't think it would work very well. Maybe I'm just too accustomed to our own system. But generally speaking, we kind of rely on the idea of a singular head of state for the way that we understand administrations and the way that we think about where we are as a country. I'm not sure that it would solve much of anything to have a dual executive. I suppose you could elevate a vice presidential candidate to a co-president level, but the question about whether the office of the presidency has too much power, I think it certainly has more power than the founders envisioned. Although they were trying to create a strong office, one of their greatest fears was that the office of president would not be powerful enough, that in a democratically minded society, that too much power would inhere in the legislature. And they were, one of the things we were focused on in the summer of 1787 is this all-powerful legislature, and how can you kind of check that? I think that one of the things that has made the presidency so powerful in recent years is the growth of partisanship in Congress that has created this, that has made Congress a more and more ineffectual body. And I think that, you know, the healthiest thing that could happen to, you know, America's democracy would be to see Congress develop a more functional method of, you know, running its own affairs. I think, you know, to some extent, the powers of the presidency have been kind of forced on presidents by the relative inaction of Congress in the modern period.
Well, you must have been reading this next question. What is your opinion on stronger regulations on elections? Does anyone have a strong opinion on that one? Maybe Professor Ryan?
Yeah, you know, I think when we think about stronger regulations on elections, I think maybe what we're thinking about is controlling the flow of money into politics. I guess I'm not sort of sure about what else we would regulate with respect to elections. I do think that, and I think there's empirical evidence that money in politics does increase polarization. When you have two candidates who are running at the primary stage, you've got the people that vote at the primary stage tend to be activists. They tend to be very strong partisans. Your average voter is not going out and casting votes for their local in their local primary elections, or even in congressional elections, House elections. And candidates depend on those people to show up in primary elections. They depend on those people for money. And I think some limitation, and I'm not sure sort of the practicalities of it or the constitutionality of it, of course, because the Supreme Court has broadly ruled that money is free speech. But I think some limitation on money in politics would perhaps have a positive effect on decreasing political polarization in this country.
We only have time for probably one more question. So I'll just ask this one, and maybe each of you take 30 seconds. What would a Biden-Harris presidency look like? What are the possible short-term and long-term effects? Any projections, any sort of predictions out there on leadership style, how that will reshape or return to the shape of the presidency pre-Trump? Who would like to go?
Well, I think I'll just start, and I'll say I'll be brief, maybe briefer than 30 seconds. I think obviously it's the Biden-Harris presidency, if they win, is gonna try to really shore up the center and rhetorically try to return to pre-Trumpian political rhetoric. And I'll stop there.
All right, Professor Hinderaker.
I don't know. I mean, I don't have a lot to say about this. I guess one of the things that I think about this election is that, you know, it really highlights for me the sort of problem of a kind of growing sense of gerontocracy in American politics. You know, of course, Biden and Harris are such different figures. I first had the chance to not vote for Joe Biden in 1988. And the fact that he's still around at this late date is just astonishing to me. But what did the presidency look like? I think I agree with Cody. I think they will try hard to kind of repudiate their sense of what the, you know, President Trump's legacy has been, and return to kind of, you know, older norms. I think, though, that they will have a great challenge in trying to hold together a very broad, diverse, and divided Democratic Party.
Professor Ryan.
Yeah, I very much agree with what was said. And let me add one more thing, which is it largely depends on whether a President Biden has unified control of Congress. If Republicans hold the Senate, I don't think that much is going to get done. And of course, we get in this trap where we want to think about the president as this very powerful person who can do whatever they want. And Joe Biden's going to become president and just stuff is going to change dramatically. And that's just not the reality of the situation. If we've got a Republican Senate, we can expect gridlock, not much to happen. If there is a Democratic majority in the Senate, assuming, of course, that the Democrats hold the House, which looks very likely, you're going to see some legislation, perhaps not a lot. It depends on how aggressive the Republicans want to be with the use of the filibuster. But of course, they also must calculate that the Democrats are seriously considering getting rid of the filibuster for legislation. So it's going to be interesting to see, but I think a lot depends on which party controls the Senate.
Professor Curry, you get the last word.
Sure, and this is where I'll use my sort of hobby horse moment, or the thing I usually talk about when I'm asked a question like this, and it's that things won't change nearly as much as you think, or as much as people wanted to. And this builds off of things that everyone else said, in that it's really hard to do stuff in our political system. Joe Biden, whether he has a Democratic Senate or not, will try to do stuff. He will succeed on some of those things, whether or not he has a Democratic Senate, probably on slightly more if he does have a Democratic Senate, though it remains true that it's hard to marshal things through our very fractured separation of powers political system. It remains very hard to unify your own party behind actual policy language, even if it's easy to unify them behind rhetoric. And so you'll see much of what you saw throughout the Trump administration, probably just with a little bit less tweeting.
A little less tweeting. Can you promise that? That would be great.
Virtually, I think I can, given Joe Biden's inclination towards the platform.
True enough. Jim Curry, Eric Hinderaker, Josh Ryan, Cody Stevens, thank you all so much for this engaging conversation. Really appreciate it.
And thank you, Jennifer.
And thanks for the questions from the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Thanks so much for joining us today. Take care.
Okay, take care.